So we are in CIIS, the California Institute for Integral Studies. And the reason we're here is that you guys did a really interesting podcast about Peterson. And yeah, I think we've been looking at what Peterson in particular has got to teach the left or progressives, because there's a lot of reactivity to Peterson, but there's also, I think we all share some sense that there are things that progressives need to learn from Peterson as well. And I think you guys did a really good job in your podcast of trying to explain what that was. Yeah, what do you hope to get? You've said yes to this interview. What do you guys hope to get from it?
Well, I think Jesse and I have been trying to find other friends that we can talk to about these issues who don't have a sort of canned response, either yay or nay, but who are trying to hold that space of inquiry. And that's why we recorded our podcast a couple weeks ago, because me and Jesse and our other friend Adam Robert, we were the three that seemed to be most interested in unpacking what Peterson has to offer, and most, I think, feeling that the left needs a bit of a kick in the butt to get things back on track.
Yeah, I would say when Adam and Matt invited me to do that podcast, we were all someone who, similar to the two of you, I believe, was starting to track Peterson, and not just Jordan Peterson and what he was saying, but also the ripples he was having in culture, the absolute phenomenon and explosion of attention that was happening around him in the media, and started kind of watching him, reading him with an open mind. My experience was an open mind, like, oh, I resonate with that. I love how he's bringing in Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and archetypal dimensions to his thinking, like how he's kind of kicking the left a little bit and calling them on some of their problematic thinking, and then watching this kind of phenomenon from the left or the far left with people just with extraordinary levels of anger and fear and distrust, and kind of the difference in that experience of my own and some of our experiences of Peterson, and then watching a lot of friends who are on the far left having radically different experience and perception of who he is and what he's bringing, and was really just curious about that. And it seems like similar to some of the stuff you've been doing with Rebel Wisdom.
And you're training as a psychologist. We do a lot of work with psychology as well. When there's a huge reactivity to something, there's always something interesting going on behind it, and then it sort of makes you inquire. It's like, okay, what are people reacting to?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Whether you love him or hate him, it's like equal proportion of intensity, and whenever that's there, it's what's kind of called a complex. Complex is a psychological, and I think Jung would say it, like it can be an autonomous complex. It's not part of the ego. It's so deep rooted, and it's, in my opinion, it's a collective complex. It's in the collective unconscious.
And it's like everyone on the right thinks everyone on the left is a Stalinist, and everyone on the right thinks everyone on the left thinks everyone on the right is a Nazi. And there's this polarization happening where people like Peterson, who are trying to carve out, I would say, not non-political, but a position that's lateral to politics, that's more in the psychological domain, to ask people to look at themselves as individuals, to question the extent to which they're projecting their shadow onto the other, which, until we can resolve issues on that level, it's going to be very difficult to resolve these political disagreements. And so that's one of the main reasons that I've found myself so interested in what Peterson is saying. Mm-hmm. He's shifting the level of the conversation, or trying to at least.
Yeah, this is the key point for me. This is why because I first found out about him in June last year, and already there was a little bit of pushback, but I'd kind of delved into the Maps of Meaning lectures. I was like, wow, there's an epic theory of everything in here. And I could already tell that people were not seeing that, because they were reacting to the political stuff so much that I was like, okay, there's a lot of people whose opinions I really value, and people I spend time with, who are just completely blocked by the political. And I think you put your finger on it, that it's not the right level to criticize him, really. And I partly, we kind of also criticized him slightly. It's like, I wish he would stay away to some degree from the political stuff, because I think what he's actually offering is far deeper than that and far more important than being seen through that political lens.
Yeah, actually what really struck me when I was listening to your podcast as well was I think I personally very much went the way of sorry, I'm going to restart that. So what really struck me when listening to your podcast was this kind of really genuine attempt to identify the walls that have been built up on the left and kind of find a way to see from within the left how can you kind of disintegrate those walls, what can the left own and what can it learn. I think I very much, after reading Wilbur's piece, Trump in a Post-Truth World, he talks about there's two different options. Either the left does that and kind of owns its stuff, or we move beyond to something else. And I was like, oh, I don't think the left can do it. I want to move beyond. And it was really refreshing to think, oh, hang on, actually, maybe there are ways. So that's kind of something I wanted to pose to you guys. What do you think are some of the things that need to happen for those walls to start breaking down?
Well, I mean, one of my critiques of Peterson is that in an age when there's all this resurgent nationalism and white nationalism, and the right is in power in this country and in the UK, why is Peterson spending so much time worrying about what the left is going to do and the authoritarianism of the left? And I get that on university campuses that is a problem, but the universities aren't really holding the levers of power politically. The universities don't have the largest military in the history of the world. Donald Trump does. And so, but then I started thinking more, well, the left lost to Donald Trump. Something is deeply wrong if the Democratic Party, who's supposed to be representing the values of the left, can't beat a reality TV buffoon. Yeah. Right? Not that Trump is stupid. He's a mastermind at the new media environment that we live in. And so the reason that I think the left needs to be in dialogue with someone like Peterson is because the left is not owning its own shadow. And the issue of identity politics is one that I feel is important for some reasons. There are oppressed populations that need their voice to be heard. But I feel like the Democratic Party has shifted the conversation, or tried to, entirely in that direction, and left the issue of the nature of the economy that we're embedded within. And even Peterson will admit that the levels of inequality we're facing are dangerously extreme, and it's destabilizing our society. And traditionally, it's been the left that helps to figure out ways to resolve that. And so how do we redistribute that wealth in a way that's not authoritarian and oppressive and top-down? That's the kind of question that I think the left needs to be asking. And it probably can't happen within the Democratic Party because it's a corporately owned party. The Republicans and the Democrats in this country both play for the same team as far as I'm concerned.
I will say I think that's a common question I get if I'm speaking about Jordan Peterson or some of these folks in the intellectual dark web is people will say, why all this critiquing of the left? Like, can't we see this rise of fascism, this rise of totalitarianism on the right? And that's a really big question, is the danger and the threat from the right is so immediate. Is it not more important to address that? And critiquing the left could be a more long-term goal and agenda. But to your point, and I heard someone bring this up to Wilbur in a podcast they did recently, and he was saying the importance of addressing the dysfunctionality of the left is that we need a strong, healthy left to fight back against the extreme and the rising of the far right. Without, with the corrosiveness that you're seeing on both the left and the right, you need a strong left, like you said. Like, we wouldn't have Trump if there had been more of a cohesive, healthy, Democratic or left candidate and party. And so what we're seeing, and that's one of my struggles and my frustration, is the knee-jerk reactionary response to Trump. People can get so focused on Trump and so much emotion gets at play. And a part of me is just constantly interested in bringing it back away from the symptom and to the underlying condition. It's like, what was the soil from which the phenomenon of Trump, was able to place roots and grow and actualize and materialize? There's something that was already there, and it has something to do with this radical polarization. And unless we on the left continue to think about it and do some self-reflective self-inquiry about how did this happen? How can we still wrap our heads around this? Russia, collusion, all that as well, but like, how on the left can we address our part in the exacerbating and accelerating polarization that is quite dangerous?
And it's what you said earlier about the shadow of the left. I mean, that was what I kind of put into the glitch in the matrix was, and it's my sort of firm conclusion, that Trump is kind of a creation of the shadow of liberalism.
Yes.
This idea of the inclusivity that is not actually inclusive, like this very sort of subtle, we're completely open to everyone and everything from everywhere as long as they think like us. Mm-hmm. And then this subtle judging of, especially in America where it's just so polarized, this sort of subtle assumption that everyone who's not on the coast is racist and bigoted, and even if it's not explicitly said, they pick it up. Yeah. You have a media, and that is, of all things that fuel Trump, it seems to me that fueled Trump. This kind of the hidden shadow of liberalism, judging others for not being as liberal as them. Yes. It's sort of the subtle catch-22 tribalism in some way.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's dangerous if we don't address it, because we have in America these elections, midterm elections in November, and then we have obviously 2020. I hear more and more people saying to me, holy shit, like is Trump gonna win, get reelected? And there's a lot of conversation, and part of me is like, if the left doesn't get this message, doesn't understand its shadow.
Don't worry, Hillary's going to run again. And next time, third time's a charm.
It'll work. Yeah. But it's important. That's where I feel it's important to speak about the left and the dysfunctionality, as well as address
Trump seems to have sent them even crazier. Yeah. Now he's kind of a lightning rod for that shadow, for that kind of anger, and it just seems to be driving even further as far as looking from the outside.
Yes.
I mean, 2 years of Trump have been an unmitigated disaster, and yet, in so many ways, he's just a slightly more extreme version of what the American presidency has been for decades. Militaristic, pushing other countries around, not caring about the poor. Immigration has been, we weren't putting kids in cages separate from their parents as much as Trump was, but isn't one kid in a cage already kind of, or 15? What's the number where it becomes Nazi versus just something that Obama did and we'll give him a pass for that? Mm-hmm. So, all these things that Trump is being blamed for are just slightly more extreme versions of what Obama did, of what Bush did, of what Clinton did. So why all of a sudden is everything being blamed on Trump?
And I will say, kind of to our conversation before this, what I think one of the problems in today's world is a lack of capacity to think in complex ways. Things are so complex. Yeah. It's complex systems, right? And that's why I think the intellectual dark web, as we were talking about, is an important space. It's a space to allow long-form conversations, for people to think out loud and slowly start to tease apart very complex issues. And we are in dangerous territory when either on the right or the left, we reduce and simplify and get polarized, because we stop seeing the complexity, and we just say Republicans are this, Democrats are this. And I think in our culture we need more spaciousness to have these conversations, to think together. And as being someone on the left, firmly on the left, it's unnerving to talk about some of this and start to get reacted to as if we're being red-pilled and going right, which is just not happening.
It's an interesting phenomenon. As we're talking, I'm kind of sitting inquiring as to whether there's such a religiosity on the left and the right, to be fair, and that's for me where the difficulty comes in going through the political area, because as soon as you go into the political realm, you're in the polarization almost by definition, and it's stuck there. Yeah. And I also find when I have these conversations online with people, they go very differently than they do in person. Yeah. And I think that's for me is one of the important things about moving beyond the ideas realm into the embodied human realm, because effectively that gives the opportunity for people to meet as humans. I've had some vicious, horrible conversations online with people that just seem to build on themselves, and I meet those same people in real life, and it's like, hey man, I'm sorry, let's let's have a conversation. Yeah.
It's true. I've experienced that too, sharing meals with conservatives, and maybe initially we're like, whoa, you believe that? And evolution's not a thing? And then after a few minutes, because we're there with each other in person and we don't want to dehumanize one another, we discover our humanity and our points of convergence. And really, I don't think the vast majority of Americans, I can't speak for the UK, I don't know the society as well, but the vast majority of Americans across the political spectrum, if they could sit down and break bread together and just talk to one another as human beings, would discover how much they have in common.
I'd also say that I mean, I grew up on the left. My parents went to CND marches, and CND was campaign for nuclear disarmament in the UK, and so we part of the Labour Party. And I know this for myself, that on the left, we have this sort of sense of judging people by their views. And it feels like, I'm not sure that the same thing is true on the right. I mean, you see quite a few people commenting, I'm far more concerned, like I have a mix of left and right views, and I'm far more concerned about talking about my right-wing views with left-wing people than I am my left-wing views with right-wing people. Mm-hmm. And there is a sense of the left kind of, I think either Brett or Eric talked about this, that who did you talk to? There's a kind of sense of, don't talk to someone over there, you'll get cooties. You'll get bad ideas. There is something about the left that's insulated, and you said religious. There is a religiosity of the left that I'm not sure you see quite as much on the right. I think, to be honest, a lot of people on the right are more used to having conversations with people outside their bubble, whereas a lot of people on the left manage to exist within that bubble.
And I think the political psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who I've been really enjoying, he wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, Why and How Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. But something he said is that, at least in America, and again, I don't know the UK as well, but most, there's a strong liberal bent for the higher education systems and universities. So if you're raised in a liberal environment, you learn from the liberal viewpoint, then you go to university, you learn from more liberal professors and teachers, and then you go on. This is what happened to me and a lot of my friends. So we actually never really read conservative thinkers or philosophers, didn't get the more conservative viewpoints. While conservatives, they would learn from conservative thinkers and philosophers or whatnot, and then they would go to university or school and they would get exposed to more liberal perspectives. So there's an argument that actually conservatives understand liberals better than liberals understand conservatives, and that kind of speaks to some of the advantages that they have in interaction, and some of that closed-minded, more echo chamber on the left. And you can see it with Trump and how Trump got elected and how wrong we got that on the left. Just a radical disconnect from, and I think that should be a signal to those on the left that we were like, our maps were way off.
Well, it's like the water we swim in. It's like, this is, because as you were saying before, why are we concentrating on the left, or why is Peterson concentrating on the left when actually the right have the power? And I think my answer to that is that most of us on the left do not realize the extent to which we have created the cultural landscape, and that actually the pathology of the left is now generally the pathology of the culture. And so, and I think the response of the right, the rise of authoritarianism, is mostly a response to the corruption of that leftist environment. And it's very difficult if you grow up on the left where you believe that the right is the one that has all the power and that you're kind of the underdogs, to realize that actually, no, you're not the underdogs anymore. You control Hollywood, you control most of the media, you control these
That's what
things.
Jordan Greenhall would say. The Blue Church went from being the underdogs to being the mainstream, not the counterculture anymore, but the main culture.
And a lot of people are resistant to that because they're like, no, we're still fighting. There's still homophobia, there's still racism, we're still the underdogs fighting against this oppressive system. And then there's this desire to find more and more oppression, even where maybe it doesn't exist.
I think there's two different levels of power. Culturally, the left has been dominant for decades, but right at the same time that ascendancy happened for the left in the cultural domain, the conservatives really took over politics to the extent to Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s, and it was so bad that Bill Clinton was running as a Democrat in the 90s, but he was actually more of a Republican. So the Democratic Party has shifted to the right in the last few decades. So politically, the conservatives have consolidated power at the federal level, but locally, in local politics and state politics, the Democrats have been losing elections left and right. The situation is way worse at these more local levels of government than it is in the federal government even right now. So culturally the left has been ascendant, but with mass media. And now with this new media landscape over the last, I don't know when you want to mark it, Trump is the first president to win because of Twitter, because of social media. He doesn't need to go through those old channels that frame who he is in a certain way. And what was it? The day before the election, I think the New York Times, the paper of record, at least until a few years ago, was saying that Hillary had a 90% chance of winning.
Yeah. Most of them had 85%, 90% for Hillary.
That's how wide the disconnect has become.
Yeah.
But in this new media environment, the left, it's a level playing field now.
But that's what's so interesting about, while we're still thinking we're the underdogs, we have to fight against homophobia and oppression. There's so much white patriarchy at play, which is true. You have a lot of other people thinking the same thing. Like now the ruling power is this liberal bent of rooting out oppression and identity politics, so we have to fight that massive wave with our underdog attitude. And I was having a conversation with a couple of friends over the 4th of July. I was on the East Coast for a wedding with some family and some friends. We're talking about 4th of July, and my friend was like, it's crazy, looking on Instagram, Facebook, I'm seeing, and this is in the United States, obviously, they're saying I'm seeing friends, like it's interesting to see our friends, some of them are just posting like wearing black and like totally boycotting 4th of July. It's seen as like such a Republican, white power, unconscious, privileged celebration of white supremacy, colonialism or something, genocide. And there's so much truth to that. And then my friend was saying, but then I'll see other liberal friends, post, with an American flag, and there's like this disconnect. We just had this interesting conversation about how on the left, people can be so uncomfortable claiming any kind of patriotism. It's like we've ceded all patriotism to the right, and we see it, we're reacting to the right who are reacting to us, and so they see us as more and more ungrateful and always criticizing what's not good about this, how that wasn't right. So then they grab more flags and sing louder, and then we see that, and then it polarizes us away. But I'm kind of like, I feel like on the left we need to reclaim and remember just the gratitude and the appreciation for this country and the good things. And it's not in any attempt to dismiss the true genocide, the true oppression, the true patriarchy and white supremacy and race that does play into this phenomenon that is America. But it feels like that's where we split, and we give things like authority, like loyalty, and like sanctity, which are 3 of the 5 kind of moral taste buds, as Jonathan Haidt talks about it, and we just cede it to the right, and the liberals just stick with harm and fairness and equality.
This point you two made about the religiosity of the left,
Yeah.
the right's obviously religious, but they know they're religious. The left denies that it's religious, so it's this different animal, and in some sense it's more sinister because there's a split where, for the left, generally people don't have some traditional form of religious practice or community, so politics starts to take on that sort of religious fervor, but it's not acknowledged as such, and that becomes ripe for all sorts of psychological projection and possession states and a judgment of others who don't agree with you.
Which is a fascinating, who was it that said, if you get rid of God, you start believing in anything? Was it some G.K. Chesterton, maybe? Like the God-shaped hole, that as soon as we get rid of religion, we find something to replace it. And on the left at the moment, like diversity, equity, all of these things, which are useful values. And this is why it's such a complicated thing to unpick. It's like, it's not that those values are wrong. Those values are right. But if you make them your lodestar, if you make them your kind of, as Peterson would say, your ideal, it leads to madness. Because it cannot be, they're valuable things to include, but if you don't make your kind of, your archetype or your ideal individual sovereignty or empowering the whatever it might be, if you make kind of equity, as in we need to have the same number of these people in this positions, your end goal, the kind of social engineering that you have to get to achieve that starts becoming insane. As I think Eric Weinstein said, you cannot build a cosmology on oppression, it leads to madness. And I think that's true.
I like that.
It makes me think there are very much 2 layers of the counterculture against the kind of dominance of the, let's say maybe the postmodern left in culture. So one of them, the political response is not the full resolution, I think, which is like more the alt-right side sometimes of kind of, showing it up and being aggressive at it. There's another level going on as well, which is what David was just talking about, which is the lack of any kind of spiritual meaning. And I think that's where Peterson's 2 levels really play out, because absolutely crucial to revivify the world and create meaning and fill that God-shaped hole in some way. But that is a different level to a counterculture on the political side. And for me, it's the lower level, you talked earlier about what's behind it. For me, that is the thing driving so much of it. So it's, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear your guys' thoughts on, you know, you move in these circles a lot, and have a lot of friends who are, you know, very passionate about kind of progressive causes. Do you feel that they can or want to fill that God-shaped hole with something other than political ideology?
I mean, I'll say absolutely, and I think I love your point about the left not being aware of its religiosity. But I would say absolutely. I've grown up and I've been really involved in social justice issues, racial justice, gender justice, involved with philanthropy and activism on a lot of different levels, actually. And that's how I was raised. So I've really been in this space my whole life. And this is the first time I've actually been encountering other viewpoints that would be either more center, more conservative. And I'm actually really, it's feeling really fruitful. It's really refreshing. It's really stimulating my thinking. It's hard to see other people not join me in that and get kind of weirded out or freaked out by it, which then makes me even more intrigued. But to your point, I think this is where kind of Wilber can come in. I think this is where Peterson comes in. I think this is where Richard Tarnas comes in, and CIIS, is when you have the kind of scientific materialism and you have more of a secular society. I experience the left as generally, not always, but generally more secular. And so that God-shaped hole is that when you lose a primal human impulse or that dimension of human experience connected to cosmology, mythology, meaning-making, sense-making, and, you know, religiosity, the encounter with the numinous or the sanctity, there's problems with that. And postmodernity is a big part of that Peterson often rails against. But you have, I would agree, like a deeper guttural intensity with which they would hold on to concepts of social justice around diversity, inclusivity, and you know, equity, like justice. And it's not that those things are not so important. It's just that when there's other things missing, there's maybe extra energy and attention and tightness or dogmatic thinking that can come with that.
Yeah. I mean, sociologists would, after World War II, they talk about what has come to be called the secularization thesis, that as technology and the capitalist market spread around the world, religion would decline precipitously because people wouldn't need that source of a big dad in the sky to take care of them because their material needs would be met. That hasn't happened at all. That thesis has now been tossed out the window, and they talk about post-secularity instead in the sociology departments. Because religion hasn't gone away. Religion is a more powerful force globally today than it's ever been before. And, you know, Muslims will be scrolling through their Twitter feed before they go pray. And it's so the idea that technology and connection would eliminate religion is false, right?
And it's a very naive view of what religion was, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. As though it were just some extra thing that we could shave off and replace. But the surrogates for religion, I think, are often worse than religion.
Right.
So we're in a situation now where liberalism, which is part of this whole secularization thesis, it's failed. And globalization has failed. We're not one big happy family. You know, it wasn't enough that we would all have our own shelf at the supermarket to buy our particular kind of food that we like, you know, and that we each got to celebrate our own version of Christmas. And that attempt to globalize diversity, it was as though it was asking everyone, you can still like wear your costumes and pray to your pretend God, as long as at the end of the day you accept science and capitalism as the true sort of unifier of all peoples, right? And so this whole approach that our governments have been working for, like liberalism in a broader sense that even conservatives would adopt as like the liberal marketplace, the free exchange of ideas and commerce, free trade, right? There's a reaction to that. That's Brexit. That's Trump being elected here. People don't feel like one big happy family. And if you believe in climate change or not, that's part of the cause of this mass migration that's going to be worsening. Like, it's just getting started. And look at the chaos that's being unleashed.
This is really the most interesting area for me, which is what the rise, the Peterson phenomena signifies. It's like, and when I saw Peterson last June, I was like, okay, this is the message. This is the right message for right now. So the kind of rise to fame that he's had since has been of no surprise, because if you strip out all of that meaning from society, you create this huge void. And Peterson, as far as I can tell, has one of the most complete understandings of what that void looks like, of what the Jungian idea, the deep archetypes, the deep religious truths that we are embedded in. And it's fascinating to see what, if this conversation is just getting started, and I hope that it is. I think you mentioned Richard Tarnas before. He had the most impact on me. I think I read Passion of the Western Mind at university and just thought, wow, this guy's really laid out where we're at and where we're going. And I think this is a really exciting conversation to get started. Peterson seems to be pulling out, I mean, he's in debates with Sam Harris at the moment, and Sam Harris is kind of like, if you want to say avatar, he's kind of the avatar for this materialist secular worldview, and Peterson is the avatar for this new re-arising religious worldview or spiritual worldview. Yeah. So it's a really fascinating discussion.
And there's that concept right of the pre-trans fallacy. So the idea that you could have one person over here talking about, let's say, Christianity and religion, and they could be very dogmatic and fundamentalist in their thinking. They could be very, missing a whole lot, and someone would say, okay, we're going to dismiss them. Then you have another person over here, maybe more akin to Peterson, who's talking about Christianity or religion, the Christ archetype, you name it. But they would have moved through, like integrated and read and learned about science and about so many other fields, and they arrive back in this place around storytelling, myth-making, and religion, but from a totally different place. But someone standing over here might see them both as the same and be like, let's toss them both out. They're both these loony, primitive people still connected to superstitious, mythological thinking. But I think Peterson is really holding that of like, let's return to religion, which, from the Dalai Lama to Carl Jung, people say, if you're in the West, you need to grapple and integrate this Judeo-Christian worldview and paradigm. And how do we reclaim that, but from a new level that synthesizes and integrates science and all these different dimensions? And I think that's one of the things I love about Ken Wilber, Jean Gebser, the Swiss cultural historian, where they're talking about different stages of development and evolution. I know there can be a lot of pushback to Wilber, some of these integral models, but that's what's really helpful for me in understanding Peterson and making sense of this moment, is like there are truths at every stage of development, and in each worldview there are different truths. They might be partial truths, but anytime any stage thinks they have the whole truth, that's where there's a problem. And I think on the left, secular liberalism can believe they have the truth, because they're all about inclusivity, diversity, equity. Now at that world-centric, pluralistic stage of consciousness, that's its primary truth. And the other stages don't care about that. It's not on their radar even. But the second they start getting righteous and thinking everyone needs to, and whoever doesn't join us immediately are deplorable and racist and misogynist, then they're actually like speaking from one level but are actually on a very dogmatic, primal level that's really no different than other fundamentalists.
Yeah. I think that's a key point. I think it was in the recent podcast with Wilbur, I think that's where it was, the question of how many of the people who are green in integral terms and in the kind of progressive really are, or are they amber or red with a progressive cloak on it? That's a real interesting thing.
Well, we all have all these levels within us,
Yes.
and when we get scared, maybe most days we're operating at green, but we feel threatened and we regress down to the red or the amber.
Yeah.
So it's not like we all have all these colors within us.
Yeah. And the other thing that came up when you were speaking is just the importance again of collective shadow work and individual shadow work, because my background is very much in the psychedelic community as well, and I help organize a conference, and I think the last 2 conferences I've given variations on the same talk, which called the psychedelic shadow, which is, hey guys, we need to own our shadows, because this isn't all about, Jamie Wheel put it really well, there's ecstasis and catharsis, and Peterson is really bringing catharsis up, like down from the depths, and traditionally communities like the psychedelic community, and probably the New Agey communities as well, and progressive communities, lots of them, they tend to go for the ecstasis and the kind of what's the utopia, what's the perfect thing, and forget the dark shadow work. And I think that's part of what's happening with the Peterson phenomena as well, is that finally, it's like finally we get both and they can meet in the middle. For me, the whole New Age movement was one massive spiritual bypass. And it seems like like in any individual, the bypass can only go on for so long before you have to get down and dirty with your shadow.
Yeah. In some sense, we need to recover the original psychedelic mystery called the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, where, from what we can tell, the evidence would suggest that there was a brew called the kykeon, which was, it could have been lysergic acid from ergot fungus. That's my hunch. That seems to be the leading theory. But the way that they would ritually ingest this was they would reenact the myth of Persephone and go into the underworld and experience that cathartic death, rebirth experience. It wasn't this escapism that a lot of psychedelic culture can now tend towards. But we don't have a ritual container that's culturally sanctioned yet.
Or elders who are initiated and using it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So my hope is that I feel like psychedelics just went mainstream a couple weeks ago when Michael Pollan published his book, How to Change Your Mind. My hope is that as these things come back into the culture, that it won't be swallowed up by the medical industrial complex, but that the culture at large will find ways of institutionalizing this in a way, in a ritualized way, that's not just a sterilized kind of you're sick, here's medicine, because Michael Pollan talks about the betterment of well people, and that psychedelics need to be, included in our culture even if you're not sick, right? So I'm hopeful about that. And incidentally, psychedelics are one place where Sam Harris and Peterson seem to meet. I haven't seen the two of them talk about that yet, but I know they both talk positively about psychedelics as a potential source of individual and maybe collective renewal. So that's an area that I'm interested to see get discussed more within the intellectual dark web circles.
Just briefly, it just came to me as you were saying that, a good model for that is a good ayahuasca ceremony.
Yes.
Because it integrates the pre-modern unashamedly. Right. It's like we are going about as pre-modern as you can go, and we're going to have a whole bunch of, there's a lot of sanctity around the ceremony. It's it has that Eleusinian mystery quality, and you're not allowed to talk about it in most places because it's not legal. So it has the the secrecy, and there's something ritually very powerful about that, especially the sanctity, because it's what you didn't get perhaps in the 60s, is that kind of wild kind of abandon.
Yeah, and the Eleusinian mystery rites are interesting because you weren't allowed to talk about what happened in the ceremony, and yet they were open to everyone, even slaves. So radically democratic and radically secret at the same time. And by the time of Plato and Socrates, the mystery had been profaned a little bit. The youth of Athens were mixing the kykeon themselves and having parties and wandering the streets, causing havoc. But
I will say, just to bring it back to your point about the shadow and Peterson bringing that, right? Because he is often talking about the suffering and the malevolence in the world and the malevolence within each of us. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, and the most dangerous thing is somebody who is not aware of their own shadow or their own malevolence or capacity for evil. And that's someone who's radically unintegrated, and then you can't really trust them. And so, I work in the prison system doing men's work. It's around emotional intelligence and healing work, working with trauma and with men who have, done profound levels of harm and violence. And we talk about that, how you can't actually trust somebody who doesn't know their own capacity for that. And so I think about on a cultural level, what's happening. And I wonder, we talk about the Me Too movement or feminism, or you talk about conversations around race, and something I've heard you speak about, maybe in that interview or that documentary about Peterson, The Glitch in the Matrix, is how when you hear the term masculinity, the first thing you think of is toxicity. You would never think of toxic, feminine. And so I'm really interested in reclaiming empowered, healthy, integrated forms of masculinity. And I think in the conversations on the left, it's a slippery slope down into anyone who's straight, white, and male doesn't have a voice. And I'm aware that all four of us, as far as I know, I don't know if you're straight, but we're white men. And I'm sure people could look at this conversation and immediately think, okay, four white men are going to talk about these issues. I'm not interested, or, I would hope they'd have an open mind to hear what we're saying. But in these circles, if you try and say something, people will be so quick. I've seen it firsthand. People will be like, cry me a river, white men, you've had all the power. It's time for you to sit down and shut up and listen. There's not much space, and any attempt to speak to that is seen as just fragility or reactionary, mansplaining. But in the work that I do in the prison system, it's one of the core concepts is that hurt people, and healed people, heal people. Yeah. So for someone who's experienced tremendous oppression, violence, abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, broken homes, living on the streets, they end up hurting people, killing people. And then they have to do some deep inner work to understand how they got there. And a lot of time it's normalizing. Say when you've been hurt and you don't integrate that, you just put that out onto other people. You hurt others because you're really wounded and cleaved inside.
This is a really key and very difficult point, because there's this kind of myth on the left of the virtuous oppressed. Like this assumption that the oppressed must be virtuous. And it's almost invariably not true. And the why it's so intractable. My mum and my dad had a very interesting divergence on this. They were both sort of left-wing, Guardian reading, which is kind of the left paper in the UK, and my dad kind of maintained a lot of the sort of classic cliched left-wing views up until he died, pretty much. My mum had a very different experience because she was teaching in a school in Southampton, a very sort of run-down school, and doing her best. And what she found was a lot of the parents didn't want their kids to succeed, or at least felt very challenged by their kids succeeding, because it challenged their own sense of the system stacked against them. And so incredibly difficult situation for her to be in, to kind of be trying to kind of help these kids and get them to succeed. But when they'd get the parents in, some, not all I'm sure, would actually either subconsciously or consciously be like, well, my kid would never go to university, university's not for the likes of us, and realizing that, wow, this is so much more difficult because people actually then buy into their own narrative about themselves and narrative about the way the world is. And she found that incredibly difficult to deal with. But it kind of, I mean, she's still very much on the left. It didn't sort of radicalize her in that way, but she had a much more nuanced understanding about what the difficulty of the situations were. And I guess we work with men's work, and we work with kind of helping people shift their beliefs, and that seems to me the only thing that would work to shift some of these social problems is really deep kind of work in terms of shifting what people's expectations about themselves are, their beliefs about their life. It's much deeper than the left assumes. Like if you give people money or you give people more opportunities, then they'll take them. It's like, no, people don't believe that they would be able to take these opportunities. It's so much more deep, a lot of these situations.
Internalized depression is
Yeah.
maybe a way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's more complex.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's really true, and I think it's important to hold that piece because, patriarchy is a really difficult and complex thing, but it's like women, I've seen women, like patriarchy is a state of mind, right? It's on some level, isn't it about radical isolation and alienation and disconnection and acting in violent ways to try and get needs met out of a primitive, scarce, I'm kind of being loose with how I'm talking about it, but I've heard women talk about, yeah, women can be patriarchal. They can be extremely, violent or aggressive with losing track of the other, no relationality, no compassionate interaction with the other.
I know women in workplaces who say most of their problems come from other women. Other women bosses. And I think there's been surveys that a lot of women would prefer to have a male boss than a female boss.
Interesting. It's not to say that there hasn't been tremendous violence, and I think it's important as we have these conversations, I'm trying to remember to talk about and rename like the reality of men's vicious and violent oppression of women, of white people's oppression of people of color, the radical inequality and injustice that still exists today. And any attempt on the left, one of the critiques I heard Jamie Wheel talking about with Peterson is like, he uses these he calls it biological reductionism, but these examples and, the pharaohs in Egypt, there was inequality of wealth, and, there was, in nature, there's inequality. And so this kind of quickness to call out any do-gooder aspirations on the left who are trying to level some playing fields and bring some equality, and to just call that out as, some sliding slope to genocide, but really name that there is incredible privilege that the four of us have in this room that so many people do not. And I'm really interested in how do we learn more about that? How do we address that? How do we really become allies to women? How do we really become allies to people of color? Because there is such real suffering. And how do we slow down these conversations and tease it apart and be able to name, well, right now on the left, this conversation is sliding into a way where I feel like as a white man, I'm getting completely dismissed, and there's no space for my thoughts on this, and then it becomes, you know, the perpetrated become the perpetrator, the oppressed become the oppressor.
Brett Weinstein is good on this, where he talks about either there's two ways that the social justice narrative plays out. Some social justice activists want to reverse the oppression, and others want to achieve some form of equality, of opportunity at least. And he's very, for good reason, worried about the ones who will reverse the oppression. And it's easy when the mob mentality breaks out that's just, you know, you point out the enemy and they are the new, you know, goat to be slaughtered, you know.
Because that, as you're saying, if someone's saying, well, you cannot speak, do not speak, that's a reverse. Yeah. That's not an equality. That's a reverse of the. Yeah. It's like now we're on top, you're below, and it's like, hang on, this isn't the society we're looking to create.
I saw a conference. I was on Facebook, and a friend was there, and it was in like Joshua Tree, and it was a conference, and it was all about, I think, gender reconciliation or women, and it said in the description, this will be only for women speakers. No man is allowed to touch the stage for like 3 days, but we want men there to be listening, but no men are allowed to touch the stage. I mean, implied is because men have been the ones on the stage with all the microphones. But it totally rubbed me the wrong way. I'm like, you're saying that feels like a total reversal. Mm-hmm. And obviously it doesn't feel good for women or people of color to have been denied access to the microphones and the stage. But to then flip it and say, we don't want anyone to touch the stage, you just listen to us, doesn't seem nuanced enough or helpful.
Yeah, it's not a particularly empowered place to come from either. It's the victim-perpetrator cycle. And then also it just makes me think of something I learned in kindergarten, which is 2 wrongs don't make a right. And it's just very, very simply boils down to something like that.
I just wanted to pick up on one thing. I felt some discomfort when you were talking about the patriarchy, as in that men were oppressing women through history. I mean, we thought about this a lot. It's like, what is the patriarchy? So there's obviously some sense of us all cutting ourselves off from a sort of direct form of knowing. We've got this kind of very rational male way of looking at the world. But I'm not, because I think men have often sort of have generally seen themselves as providers. They've shut themselves off from a part of themselves to go out to work. There's a disposability of men. Like, all of these things seem to be true at the same time. Like, I don't, and I think there's a danger of it getting into a conspiracy theory version of the patriarchy when we just see it as one sex oppressing another. Right. And I think it's a really interesting, like, that's why I think the term patriarchy is so difficult to use, because people have different opinions of it. And I do think that it obscures the disposability of men. It obscures the fact that men pretty much self-sacrifice themselves to go out and work in some pretty horrific environments.
If you're not the patriarch, patriarchy kind of sucks, even if you're a man. Yeah. You know, if you're not the eldest son who inherits all the land, if you're one of the little brothers, patriarchy kind of sucks.
So sucks for pretty much everyone. Yeah. It's true. I appreciate that pushback. I think it's, for me, that the discomfort I have is trying to find this point of like pushing back on the unhealthy way we use words like patriarchy, then also wanting to like remind myself, I guess, of my own privilege, ways if I walk down the street, if I go for a job interview, there may be certain privileges that just support me in the way they don't support other people. And so it's trying to like name, you know, some of the injustice and the real brokenness of some of the systems, trying to support folks who are at the bottom, how to rise up. But I also hear you saying, you know, it's a good point that it's problematic to simplify and say just men against women, just white people and folks of color, black people. Yeah. It's problematic to simplify.
It is.
And it's holding that subtlety of there are these forces, there are these things that are kind of undeniable. As soon as it becomes an ideology, as soon as it becomes a kind of fixed idea, then we're in trouble. It's like holding. It returns to the point you were talking about before. I think the sign of a mature mind is being able to hold things that are equally true but contradictory at the same time. Right. And it's a difficult thing to do, because I think this maybe links into the fact that we use language. We assign concepts to things, and we are kind of, as Wittgenstein talked about, we're bewitched by language. Mm-hmm. We automatically gravitate to a singular understanding of everything rather than being able to hold the fact that many things are true at the same time.
And I mean, we've done a lot of hating on the intellect and irrationality, but Ralph Waldo Emerson said once, thinking is the hardest task in the world. Thinking is the hardest task in the world. And I find whenever I tend to get emotional in a political discussion, I kind of regress into an ideological complex. And I speak from a position that's not really mine. I'm sort of, it's the position that I've been steeped to believe is the good one, and I'm not thinking anymore. And so, as much as we might want to critique hyper-rationality and materialism and scientific reductionism and everything, whatever we're moving into is not going to be irrational.
Right.
You know, it's going to integrate the mind and the intellect and everything we value in our capacity to think. And the intellectual dark web, so much of what it's allowing back into the culture is this slowing down, this opening up of a space of possibility to think through the options and to say, yeah, we have values that are deeply emotionally rooted that we want to protect and speak to, but how do we, we could share the same values but have different ways of operationalizing them, realizing them in the world. And we could learn a lot from one another about how to operationalize. Like, even if we all think equality of opportunity is a great thing, how do we achieve that? The left might have a very different way of doing it than the right. Maybe we need to beta test a bit and work with each other to see what works from each side, and then assemble that into something that can deal with the complexities of the world that we're living in. So yeah, just a little plug for thinking.
We like thinking.
Yeah.
I want to bring back to something you said before about the father archetype, because I think that, as a big picture, I think that speaks to the charge that Peterson is bringing more than anything else, and possibly speaks to a deeper resolution of what he's bringing as well. Because I really feel that what he's bringing is this kind of structure, this father archetype. A lot of the deep history of Western culture, probably up until and including the 60s, because Jung is a big part of it as well. Like, he's channeling this deep story of Western culture, and by definition, there is a big sort of patriarchal element to that story. And I think there probably is a deeper resolution of if he's bringing back the divine masculine, and I think we have lost a lot of the divine masculine in the last 30 years. There is a sort of, well, anything goes, do whatever you want, which doesn't actually speak. We need structure, we need discipline, we need self-responsibility, and that is what he's bringing back. But I do think that there is probably a deeper resolution to the energy that he's bringing, and that is the feminine as well. There is some sort of divine feminine energy that needs to be brought back. And if the crisis that we're seeing at the moment is, and I believe it is, a kind of male crisis of having shut ourselves off from intuition, having shut ourselves off from sort of more direct ways of knowing. It's the ultra-rationalist, materialist, secular paradigm of rationality that seems to be breaking down. And which is a very exciting time if there's a chance for something new to be born from it. And I know that Richard Tarnas in particular has talked about this as a kind of shift in consciousness that's likely to happen when he kind of gave some predictions for it. It feels like this is the time that Tarnas and other people have been talking about probably since the 60s, that this rationality space is going to break down and then something new will need to be born. Yeah. And I think part of that is reopening to the direct, intuitive, feminine, for want of a better word, ways of knowing.
I mean, this touches on a number of things. One is, right, men also suffer under patriarchy, this mentalist, intellectual, disenchanted worldview of alienation and isolation. That's the endless hunger that drives us to, try and control violently and take all for ourselves. But also, we were talking about Jean Gebser's and like the breakdown between stages and levels of consciousness and the end of this mental stage and into this next. But I think it's absolutely true. We're trying to find as a culture what's healthy masculine, what's the healthy father energy, what's healthy feminine, what's healthy mother or female energy, or the mother energy. And I was reading this article by Michael Aaron Kamens, and he was saying how Peterson is this lightning rod because he's carrying this father, masculine energy. But he was saying that Jung saw it in the 50s or the 60s, I guess the 50s, when the Catholic Church officially made it Catholic doctrine, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. Yeah. And he said, that's it. That's finally the re-arising of the feminine, of the divine feminine. kind of institutionally being recognized. He also saw the emergence of World War I and World War II as Wotan or Dionysus energy, this repressed kind of feminine chaos, Dionysian archetypal energy, that god who'd been repressed for thousands of years under Christianity, emerging, but it was also chaotic and violent how it emerged. But then through the 60s and up until now, the last 100 years, starting in the 30s, I guess, it's been this reassertion of the divine feminine or the divine mother energy, but that somehow it might also be slippery and turning into that devouring mother, more pathological. And so it's this kind of awkward thing where, especially as men, if we're trying to say, oh, now it's the devouring mother and calling out that the unhealthy pathological aspect, there's no term of toxic femininity yet. Mm-hmm. But of course, how weird is it that there's toxic masculinity, but there's no toxic femininity?
Yeah, Jung is an interesting figure in this sense. He's certainly the wise old man, but all of the analysts, most of the analysts around him were women, you know, Tony Wolff and Marie-Louise von Franz. And so he's catalyzing this sense of empowerment of the women around him. And the Assumption of Mary was something he pointed to as at least the beginning of the rise of the feminine. And he critiqued Christianity and the Trinity in particular for having these three dudes at the seat of power of the universe. And he thought that 3 is an unstable number, we need the quaternity, and the 4th he identified with the feminine. And that our culture is, our Judeo-Christian culture in the West is seeking some more stable psychological orientation.
And that was the feeling function.
The feeling function, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's one issue it's a bone I've been wanting to pick with Peterson for a while, which is this very literalist identification in mythology of the feminine with chaos and the masculine with order. I'm not a mythology expert or anything, but if you think about Athena or any queen archetype, these aren't chaotic goddesses. And on the male side, if you think of Dionysus, you mentioned, the trickster, like there are plenty of examples of male deities and female deities that break that easy identification of masculine with order and feminine with chaos. I just wanted to point that out.
It's interesting. I was literally thinking about that point right before you said it, and it's maybe another way to see it, because I'm thinking, as soon as you said Jung was a big fan of the Gnostics, who I'm a big fan of, and there is, in their mythos, there is a sense of the feminine not as chaos so much as undifferentiated. Right. And then they have Sophia and Christos, the role Christos plays is similar to the role of the green man in Celtic mythology. It kind of puts every species in its niche and creates order in the not chaos so much as the undifferentiated. Yeah. And that, for me, is part of what's going on with Peterson, and just with the shift away from postmodern hyper-relativism, is that the natural response to that is to place some order in it. And to put things into their niches, so to speak. And part of that is hierarchies, part of that is breaking things down and saying, okay, we need to accept this and this from biology, we need to look at this and this, and it's still ongoing. That's the thing. So it is, to use the word chaotic, it's still a bit chaotic, because these are very complex things, and I feel like it's it's two things coming together. But hopefully it gets to somewhere where there's a deeper resolution.
Sacred marriage. I mean, that's how Richard Tarnas talks about it in the epilogue of Passion of the Western Mind, is that, clearly the masculine rational consciousness has been driving the Western ego and Western culture to this point, and all the while alienating itself from the feminine. Mm-hmm. And we just can't continue moving forward in that way for so many reasons. Culturally, ecologically, often the earth or Gaia is identified as the feminine, and some feminists have a problem with that, and I get that, but there's a need to reintegrate the human being, especially in its hyper masculinized Western form, with the broader community of life on this planet. And if that's not the need for a sacred marriage, like, I don't know what is. And the crisis that we're facing right now is, I don't know whether to call it one crisis or multiple crises. It's a meta-crisis that is social, political, economic, ecological, gender-based, racial, but it's all they seem like symptoms of some underlying archetypal
which goes
challenge.
To your point about some deep I don't know what to call it, spiritual, religious, meaning-based problem. I mean, we're obviously, Wilbur would say, or Gebser, we're moving beyond and through in a natural, it's important. Sometimes Peterson feels reactionary, like postmodernity and all this stuff, scientific materialism is a huge mistake, and we need to kind of go backwards. I'm not convinced he's saying we have to go backwards, but it's a mistake. As opposed to Wilbur, who says, no, that's a natural stage. It's like an adolescent child. You go through your...
Right before birth, the womb becomes toxic.
Right.
That's what gets the baby the hell out
but
of it.
we have to go through it. There's no way out but
Right.
through.
Right.
And so how do we reclaim a profound relatedness and relationality to the cosmos, to the planet, to each other, to the divine? When you talk about the meta crisis, it's like fractally showing up in every field, in every way.